Welcome to Michelle Young's book talk, The Art Spy, the extraordinary untold tale of World War II resistance hero Rose Valland, an unlikely heroine who infiltrated the Nazi leadership in Paris during World War II to save the world's most treasured artworks. I'm Rachel Stern, Executive Director of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. Today, I'm honored to introduce Michelle Young, who is an award-winning journalist, author, and professor whose writing and photography has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, Hyperallergic, The Forward, and Narratively. She is a graduate of Harvard College in the history of art and architecture and holds a master's degree from Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, where she is a professor of architecture. She's the founder of the publication Untapped New York. She divides her time between New York City, Paris, and the Berkshires, Massachusetts. After the presentation, there will be time for Q&A, so please post your questions. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me. It is a real honor to be doing this with the Fritz Ascher Society, as the subject matter is so aligned with the undergirding of this book and why the events surrounding Rose Valland's life in the war in World War II occurred. I would love for you to pepper me with questions. So please, anything and everything, I will want to answer them. So do not hesitate to send questions. I believe it's through the chat. So my book, The Art Spy, The Extraordinary Untold Tale of World War II Resistance Hero Rose Valland, came out just about 1 month ago. And we just got news that we are going into our second reprinting in hardcover. So that is very, very exciting for me. And I always had a hunch that Rose Valland would have particular success in America because many of her personal qualities, I think, are very American. I think the idea of fighting from the outside, of hard work, of ingenuity. She had all of these traits. So I want to give you some background about Rose, and we'll go into her life in the war. And there is also in this book a secondary storyline of the Rosenberg family, Paul Rosenberg, who was the exclusive dealer for Picasso, Brecht, Matisse, and Leger. And Paul and his family managed to flee France during World War II and come to New York City. So one question I often get is, how did you discover Rose Valland? So I would say that it's no hyperbole that I spent maybe a decade exclusively reading World War II books and then half a decade reading female spy, true story World War II books. And through that, all of that reading, I had not come across Rose Valland, but I came across her in this book, Goring's Man in Paris by Jonathan Petropoulos, which is about a Nazi art looter and art historian that was assigned to the Jeu de Paume Museum, which we will learn that is where Rose was working in Paris. That Nazi plunderer was named Bruno Lohse, and he was Rose's nemesis in the museum, and really throughout the end of their lives, they despised each other. So every few chapters in this book, a woman named Rose Valland would appear. And I was just amazed and wanted to know more. And once I understood the basic outlines of her life, I had a hunch that her wartime life was likely much more exciting than was known. And I think that is the case with all underrepresented stories from World War II and other time periods. Women, in this case, we have a woman, a lesbian, an art historian. So all these things that make her, as described earlier, an unlikely spy. You may have heard of Rose before from the film Monuments Man. She, or a character named after her, was played by Cate Blanchett and called Claire Simone. However, she is presented as a straight female who essentially gives up her hard-won intel because she falls in love with Matt Damon. And for those who may have watched some films from the 1960s, The Train with Burt Lancaster is actually optioned off of a chapter in Rose Valland's memoir. It is mostly a caper film, but in the first few minutes of the movie, a character named differently but inspired by Rose appears and jumpstarts all the action that takes place. So, to begin with Rose herself, Rose is born in a countryside village in Saint-Étienne de Saint-Joie. This is about 40 miles southeast of Lyon. It is a region that was very Catholic, still bears the scars of the religious wars that were fought in the area, many memorials and such to the martyrs who gave their lives in the religious cause. And it is a town filled with many medieval turrets and such. And Rose is born from in the working class. She is the daughter of a blacksmith and really has an unlikely rise to the pinnacle of the art world in France. So one of the first things I did, and my background, maybe I should explain that a little more, is I studied the history of art and architecture at Harvard as an undergraduate, and then got my master's in urban planning in the architecture school at Columbia, where I teach as a professor of architecture now. And for me, going to a place is the most important thing. So whether it's for journalism or for architecture, you really get a sense of what a place is like, who a person is by visiting a place in person. And so even before I sold this book, even before I had a literary agent, I showed up in Rose's hometown. And what I discovered was that there is a place named after her, Place Rose Valland. But unfortunately, it is the post office parking lot in town. And for me, this told me almost everything I needed to know about Rose Valland, that she indeed is a forgotten heroine. And I was eager to dive into this period of her life. One thing I did on that visit was to go to the town hall and ask them if they knew anything about Rose. They said, oh, yes, we've heard of her, but we really don't know much about her. But there is a woman in town who is head of the Rose Valland Association, or the Association for the Memory of Rose Valland. And here is her phone number, which they wrote down on a tiny piece of paper. And I held on to this as gold, like all journalists hold on to their sources. And I did not contact her until I had a book deal and began my research, because I did not want to waste anybody's time. But I knew she would be a main contact that I would like to reach should I start to write this book. And then I showed up in front of Rose Valland's house. This is the house she grew up in. I was very pregnant as I was deciding and putting together the idea for this book. And there was a friendly cat. And so the part that you saw in the photo before, on the right side of this picture, is the living quarters. But on the left is the forge in which her father worked. He was a former military man in France, experienced with horses, and took over the family forge of actually Rose's mother's family. And in town, another spot to visit is actually where Rose is buried. It's the family vault of the Vallant family. And nowadays there is also a plaque in the front about Rose, which you can see here. So Rose is born in 1898. She starts school late because she has some illnesses as a child. But her mother recognizes some of her early talents in studies and in art. And so very diligently applies for her daughter to go to better schools that can be offered in their hometown. So as an early teenager, Rose is sent off to a town nearby to boarding school. From there, she goes to the Teachers College in Grenoble, which would be the equivalent of high school. This is some photos from her teenage years. And after that, so she spends World War I, in fact, in Grenoble studying. And then after that, she gets into the École des Beaux-Arts in Lyon. There, she wins many awards, school-wide, regional, national, in the fine arts and in the study of art. And she passes a 40-hour exam to go to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the pinnacle of arts education in France, where all the French masters have studied. So these are photos of Rose in the 1920s when she arrives to Paris. I love this photo on the left, which is slightly cropped, but she's basically in her apartment. It's what they call a chambre de bonne, or the servants' quarters, the maids' quarters at the top floor of the Haussmannian Parisian buildings. And it reminds me a bit of a Vermeer painting with the light coming in from the side and some kind of still life set up. But in the background, she has a shrine, a religious shrine, and a picture of Jesus. She's very studious, but also at this time, she's really exploring her sexuality a bit. And so here you see she has a very short boy haircut. But by the 30s, when she's looking for a job, she returns to a very standard, traditional way of dressing that will hopefully get her a job in the civil service. So after or during the time that she's at the École du Louvre in Paris, I believe she recognizes that it will be very difficult for her to become a fine artist. And she doesn't really want to settle for being just an art teacher, which is really the other avenue if you don't become a fine artist if you go to the École du Louvre. So, the École des Beaux-Arts. So she applies and gets into the École du Louvre, which is training future art historians and future art curators. And unfortunately, while she is there, she comes across her first nemesis, a man named Henri Verne, who is rather misogynist, classist, and he takes a disliking to her. And this is because Rose is really an upstart from the middle of nowhere France, who has risen and gotten many degrees in the arts and has many mentors. One who is Henri Verne's rival. His name is Henri Faucillon. He is a famous art historian, well-known orator, and now the head of the Sorbonne, which would be considered a rival of the École du Louvre. And Henri Verne sees Rose as a countryside girl and should have no part in the arts world in France. And so he gives her a very bad grade on her thesis and calls it not art history. And I'll tell you the name of her thesis. It is The Study of Movement in Italian Art from the Renaissance to the Present Day. So nothing dramatic or extraordinary, but at the time, it was still believed that the study of art and art history was to look purely at static images. The idea that movement could be captured in art was really something avant-garde and cutting edge. But some of these ideas were trickling down from Henri Faucillon, and so Rose explored that in her thesis. And the funny thing is, when I started to understand Rose's life story, there were many similarities and things identified with her. And one of them is that when I was at Harvard, I wanted to write my thesis on the study of fashion design as represented from Greek vase painting to present day at the time, early 2000s. And I was told that that was not art history and I should switch to the sociology department. But I only had 6 months left in school, and I said I cannot start a new degree at this time. And so Rose, by getting this poor grade from the head of the school, who happens to also be the head of the Louvre and the head of all of the French national museums, she will not be able to get a job at the Louvre, which is, if you've gone to the École du Louvre, this is you want to work in the Louvre, you want to probably be in the Department of Paintings. And so she applies everywhere, hoping to get a job, unsuccessfully, because every time Henri Verne is asked for his opinion or for a recommendation, he goes out of his way not only to say no, but to write at length why she should not be hired. And in one letter, he mentions that should a job be necessary, it should be with someone with far more degrees than she has. And at this point, she has the equivalent of multiple master's degrees in various aspects of art history. And so it's hard to imagine anyone else who would have more degrees than Rose. And I call her in the book a roaring 20s overachiever, a rare moment in which I allowed a kind of a modern day phrase to enter. But I think this is really who she was. And so one of the doors that did open to her was as an unpaid secretary at the Jeu de Paume Museum, which you see in this photograph here. She begins work there in 1932. It is maybe not the most prestigious museum, because again, the Louvre is right next door and you can see it in the background of this photograph, but it is a museum focused on the international schools of modern art. And so they were doing art by country. So the art of Germany, the art of Austria, the art of Latvia, even the United States. They worked with MoMA on a huge exhibition called 3 Centuries of American Art, which showcased photography, film, and paintings and sculptures over the 3 centuries of America's history. And so she takes this job there as an unpaid secretary because her boss in the museum, curator Andre Deserrois, who is a World War I aviation hero, needs someone who can type. But he does his best to support her, even though he cannot get a budget for her to work there. So he also hires her to work on his magazine. And so she spends 7 years unpaid in this museum. And normally it is actually very difficult for someone to move from a secretarial track into the curatorial track. So this took extreme effort on Rose's part. She had letters of recommendation from the who's who of France. There's even one from a French senator. And so even job by 1936. And what's very interesting about Rose is that she becomes very active in the curation of this museum. And you see the exhibitions start to become tied to geopolitical things happening in Europe. And so right in the months before Austria is annexed, there is the exhibition about Austrian art. Then there's an exhibition about Poland, etc. And since this museum is part of the French National Museums, it's thought that perhaps this can be a tool of diplomacy, a way to create connections and bonds between nations so that perhaps peace can be restored despite what is happening. And so there we are through the 1930s, Rose working on these international exhibitions at the Jeu de Paume Museum. This is a photograph of her from the mid-1930s with her boss, Andre Deserrois, who was wearing the suit and one of the guards in the museum. And this is an exhibition about an Argentinian sculptor. And so through the 30s, you start to see Rose occasionally get mentioned. Sometimes she's listed in the programs, the exhibition catalogs. Sometimes she's listed in the newspaper articles about the new exhibitions. And every opening at the Jeu de Paume is really a star-studded event covered in the arts papers, in the major newspapers. People like Picasso and other artists would come and hobnob with the French civil service and other important people in France. I want to take a moment here and talk about Rose's personal life in the 1930s. So one of the big research coups in the Art Spy was digging into Rose's personal life. And Rose was someone who was a true academic. She never really expressed much of her emotions. It took me 4 years to write and put together this book. And it took me that amount of time to understand her personality. And so by the end, I knew that sometimes when she was writing, she was actually being very emotional. But on first glance, anyone read it would think it was kind of a dry statement. So I knew that if I could crack the story of her personal life, we could perhaps add a layer of understanding to Rose as a person. And so if you look at Wikipedia today, actually, it still says that Rose met her partner Joyce after the war in Germany. That misconception is because Joyce here, pictured here, is half German. She's born in Liverpool in England, grows up in England, but then by middle school and high school is moved to Germany with her family and studies there. And in her late teens, she comes to Paris to be finished. She goes to a finishing school in Paris. And one of the discoveries I made through sifting through many, many documents is how Rose and Joyce met. In fact, Rose was the French teacher at the school that Joyce attended. And so they would have met in the late 1920s. After graduating from the Sorbonne, Joyce goes to work in America, in Chicago. She's working as a stenographer and a secretary. And so and then she returns in 1934 to France and lists Rose in her applications for an ID card and other things that she needs. And so they're close enough for her to list Rose as someone who can testify for her as a person. And then by 1936, they are living together in an apartment in the Latin Quarter. So a lot of these documents about Joyce I discovered because she worked for the U.S. Embassy in the mid 1930s to the beginning of the war. So luckily for Rose, in 1939 she has there's a new head of the Louvre and a new head of the French National Museums, and his name is Jacques Chagard, a very suave Humphrey Bogart, Cary Grant-like figure that is well loved and very good at commending teams and inspiring people to work together. Here's another photograph of him. And so he takes on the job of protecting the art in the museums of France during in the lead up to a future war. And so they make elaborate plans and decide and requisition many castles through the Loire Valley and the south of France. And once war breaks out in 1939, a massive evacuation effort occurs. And Rose is part of that because she's essentially left in charge of the Jeu de Paume. Her boss goes back, is recalled to the Air Force, and she is in charge of packing up the art, deciding what's going to be sent over the Loire Valley and what is going to be protected on site in the basement of the museum. And so here are just some of the many, many lists that Rose made. You can see that all the art is organized by the school, by the country. When I say school, it means so École Anglaise, the British School of Art, and these are all modern paintings, Belgium, Italy, etc. You can catch some very famous names here: Winslow Homer, Mary Cassatt, Pablo Picasso, Boldini, and others, Max Liebermann, who I know has a connection to Fritz Ascher, and the like. And here are some paintings that were actually in the Jeu de Paume's collection. It became quite a robust museum in the time that Rose worked there, acquiring a lot of work of art in a short period of time. Mother and Child by Mary Cassatt, a painting by Alfred Stevens, and a portrait by Picasso, pre-Cubist, as you could see. So here is a letter that Rose has written to her cousin back at home, and this is in the spring leading up to World War II breaking out. And she writes, "This Hitler turns out to be very tiring." And I love this because it shows a bit of her humor, but also what's going on in Paris during this time. There's a lot of unrest. There's concern about what Hitler is doing. He is making a lot of threats. And as a result, the museums are preparing for war and trying to figure out when they need to start the war alert. And the museums actually had a chance to test out their war preparations in 1938, in fact, during the crisis over the Sudetenland. And they moved a large portion of the collection to the Loire Valley. And then when the Munich Agreement was announced, they moved it all right back. And I want to take a moment here to talk about Hitler, his obsession with art. He had wanted to be a painter and an architect and was rejected from the Vienna School of Art twice. And this is where he formulates his time in Austria and Vienna was very painful for him. And he was virtually homeless, living on park benches and making what he called derivative art for tourists. And this is where he starts to form his very virulent anti-Semitic creeds. And they're all tied to this feeling that he has that he's been rejected from the arts world in Vienna. He starts to believe that there is a Jewish cabal that has prevented him from becoming the artist that he's meant to be. And so all of this ends up in Mein Kampf. But at the same time in the 30s begins the attack on modern art in Germany and Austria. And for Hitler, he sees that the Jewish collectors, what he sees in the literary world and the arts world in Austria, he feels that it's been dominated by Jewish collectors who are focused on the avant-garde. And for Hitler, if you've seen his paintings, they are fine, I guess, very representational, nothing interesting. And so he struggles to understand anything non-representational. And so he gives modern art a catchy title, Entarrte Kunst, degenerate art. And they start to pull tens of thousands of paintings out of German museums. And they burn some, they sell some. So I set this all up in my book, The Art Spy. There is a chapter about an auction in 1939 in June that takes place in Lucerne, which is the best of the art that's been seized from the German museums. And everyone knows that the proceeds are going to support the German war effort. But from Hitler down, they deny and deflect this charge. And you'll also see in the book Hitler's desire to create a Führer museum, a museum that would showcase all the centuries of the best German art and will be the largest museum ever created. And he hires a curator from the Dresden Gemälde Gallery to lead that. And so in the book, you also see this curator who was originally fired from his job for having collected some modern art and put them on the walls of the museum. He gets resurrected and defended by an art dealer who was close with Hitler and selling Hitler paintings. And so you see this man, Hans Posse, you see this curator arrive to the Berghof to meet Hitler, not for the first time, but it's the moment where he gets assigned the job to create this Führer museum. And so this sets off partially the reason for all the looting of art that takes place all around Europe during World War II. And so anytime Germany would occupy a country, they would, of course, set up their government, but then immediately at the same time begin looting. And I think you can really see in the records, it's very clear that the path between art looting and the concentration camps is a linear line that begins with the taking of art and eventually the taking of nationalities and deportation, and then finally extermination camps. And so I think one of the things that I didn't even know, even though I've written about looted art and such, was by going through all of the German decrees very carefully, understanding how intricate art was to the German ideology and the Nazi ideology, and how tied it was to the unfolding of the war. So going back to the protection of art, the museums were not protecting the art because they were afraid that the Germans would take it. They were worried about damage due to oncoming troops. So from bombs, etc., happening inside Paris and the other museums. And so that therefore there was a need to move it to more rural areas, to the Loire Valley, and to hide them in the castles there. And so here are some photographs of the art that you may recognize. There was only one piece of art in the whole collection of the French museums that had priority color-coded, 3 dots of color-coded, and that was the Mona Lisa, which had 3 red dots. The others had other lesser dots to indicate their importance. This is a photo of the Mona Lisa getting, actually being reopened after the war was over. And then, so paintings were put into crates, sometimes huge crates like this one, where they were stacked and then closed up and shipped off on trucks and trailers. On the walls of the Louvre, they would write the names of the paintings that had been taken, and they would put the frames below them and roll the paintings up. And the writing would enable, hopefully, the future return of these paintings one day. Here in the Daru Gallery in the Louvre, they were wrapping up priceless sculptures. You can see the victory of Samothrace, in fact, in the very back of this photograph. They had to move that with pulley and rope very carefully down a staircase. And a lot of the curators actually believed that the rope would crack and the whole thing would shatter. And there was also art that remained protected on site with sandbags in the Louvre. Here is the Venus de Milo getting wrapped up along with the Victory of Samothrace on the right. And all of the largest history paintings were taken down from the walls and rolled up. So this is Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. And just a kind of haunting photo of the Louvre empty, and you get a sense of how large these paintings were and the scale of the endeavor that was needed to protect all of this artwork. And the trucks would leave. So all of this began a week before World War II broke out, and every day two convoys of trucks would leave the museums and go to the Loire Valley. And this continued for months because the museums were not only transporting the art of the Louvre and other museums, they were in charge of, for example, the Comédie Française, the theater company of France, and private art collectors, many of them Jewish, were giving their collections temporarily to the museums for safekeeping. So the museums were packing and moving that art as well. And many artists, Monet's family gave artwork to be stored, Leger as well. And so they went to castles, the grandest of all, which is the Château Chambord, which is part of the French national heritage. So it was a castle that they did not need to commandeer from another family. It was already available, but as you read in the book, it was not a very suitable interior for people to stay or to store art. There were 500 rooms, hidden staircases, keys that were rusted, and only one bathroom. And so a lot of work had to be done to make it appropriate for it. And here's just me going to the roof with a curator at the castle now, who took me on a wonderful tour throughout all of Chambord in order to write this book. And there is, for anyone who does visit, there is actually an exhibition about the protection of art inside on the roof of the castle. And so here are some of the props that actually came from a movie that was filmed on site there. And this is the grand staircase inside the Château Chambord, designed by Leonardo da Vinci. And so now we're entering the meat of the story. Rose gets put in charge in June 1940 as the Germans are invading, knocking on the gates of Paris. She doesn't want to leave the Jeu de Paume. She feels that her role is to protect the remaining art in the art collection. She has arranged with her boss and the head of the Beaux-Arts administration in France that she will stay as the only art historian, but it becomes too dangerous. And in the morning of June 13th, 1940, she gets a call from her boss, Jacques Chajard, that she must leave the museum immediately. And she's so angry about this. She sends off a bunch of letters, and she writes on a piece of letterhead that at the crack of dawn, she was asked to leave. And she makes all the museum guards sign this document as proof that she was forced to leave and she didn't abandon her museum. And so she takes a very treacherous route, which I don't want to give away, but I discovered what happened to her at this time through an unpublished cut chapter of her memoir, which was extremely exciting to find. And then she goes to the Loire Valley, almost does not survive that trip, and in July 1940 is sent back under occupied France, occupied Paris, to go back to work inside her museum. And this is, so a few months later, the Nazis ask for a new location to store their looted art. They've run out of space in the rooms allocated to them in the Louvre. And her boss, Jacques Chajard, decides that they'll have the Jeu de Paume. And he commands Rose, as you can see here, to remain at all costs at the Jeu de Paume Museum, which the ERR, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, which is the organization in charge of looting, but really their main mandate was to collect materials of Germany's enemies, Jews, Freemasons, communists. They would scavenge and empty out libraries and archives looking for this material. But on the side, Hermann Göring was aligned with Alfred Rosenberg, and so the art looting kind of came under the jurisdiction of this agency. And so Rose is given permission through an agreement between the French National Museums and Vichy and the Germans that she will be the one French national art historian in the museum. And originally her role is to make a duplicate inventory of everything coming in. But on day one, when the Germans arrive, beginning of November, a Harvard-trained art historian shuts her notebook brusquely and says there will be no inventory done by the French. And she has to figure out and finagle a reason why she should be allowed to stay. And so she speaks to the man in charge, Kurt von Baer, a Nazi straight out of central casting with a one glass eye and a long green coat of wolf hair collar. And she manages to convince him that she can stay in the museum. And so for the next 4 years, Rose is documenting who's coming in, what's happening, what art is being looted, taking meticulous notes. You can see some of her reports to Jacques Jaujard here. The top left one is about one of the visits of Hermann Göring. Göring came 20 times to visit the Jeu de Paume. Each time it would be set up just like an art exhibition in a museum, and in addition, laid with carpets, stolen, of course, potted plants, and champagne would be served. Sometimes they were so excited about what was being shown to them, the quality of the art, that they would saber a champagne bottle to celebrate. And as you can see also on the right side here, she would take notes of eventually where the shipment labels and such of where their art was going in Germany and Austria. And so here would be the Germans processing, taking their own meticulous notes. They had these index cards that were pre-printed that conveniently would say where they stole the art from, who the artist was, what the size of the painting was. And the art historians would actually also initial their names to show that they were the ones that processed it. So it would go through the Louvre, get processed, and then come to the Jeu de Paume for exhibition and such. And so here is one of Göring's visits to the Jeu de Paume Museum. He would arrive with a very large entourage. Everything would be prepared. The art historians, the Germans, would be very stressed in advance. And he would spend hours, sometimes days, going through all the artwork, holding them in his hand. He really believed that he was what he called the last Renaissance man, a true connoisseur of art. In fact, he was just a very gluttonous collector. And so he would select paintings. He would give first choice, the best, to Hitler, but he decreed that he himself would get second choice. And then everything would be packed up and put on a train car, his private train car, and headed to Germany. And so this would just repeat and repeat. High-level Nazis, lower-level Nazis, French collectors would come in and do exchanges. The Germans didn't really know what to do with modern art, the Entarrte Kunst, degenerate art I mentioned. And so that kind of rapidly collected in one room that they called the Salle des Martyrs, the room of the martyrs. And at some point, Bruno Lose, Hermann Göring's personal art dealer who worked in this museum, came up with an idea that they could exchange the modern art away. So perhaps 20 Picasso paintings could be exchanged for one Vermeer, or even more often, a mix of modern art paintings, Matisse, Picasso, etc. And so that's how they were able to kind of quickly try to liquidate the stock of modern art that Hitler despised, and they weren't sure what they could do with them. And so here are some photos of what it would look like as Hermann Göring would walk through. So again, just like any other museum exhibition. Here is Göring sitting in front of two paintings owned by Paul Rosenberg that have been looted from his collection. Bruno Lose, the man on the right, who served him personally as well as being in the German army, showing off the paintings, and other onlookers looking on. And this is a photograph of Alfred Rosenberg's visit to the Jeu de Paume Museum, where again he's welcomed not only by Germans but also French people. And he takes a tour of the looting operation, but he comes fairly late in the war. He was not interested in art at all. He really was hyper focused on those materials of the enemy, and he had written a book that really helped formulate Hitler's most terrible racist concepts. So one of the things that Rose pilfered from the museum were negatives, photographic negatives. A lot of them were of art, but the German staff for the Jeu de Paume also took the time to have portraits made of themselves. And so this is how she was able to give to the Allies when they arrived to Paris photographs of all the people who were involved in the looting. And they knew what they looked like when they captured them. Here is the salle de métier that I spoke about. It was, as you see, filled floor to ceiling, and they had to add these extra display stands for all the art that was being filled there. And then once all the art was selected by Goring and others, it would go on a truck and head to the trains or head directly to Germany. So sometimes I get asked, where did you find all the material for this book? So a lot of the material is in the French National Archives, but also the French Diplomatic Archives. I met with Rose's family to tell her wartime story, and her partner Joyce's family. A lot of the material is on microfilm and in very heavy boxes. And I just want to take a moment here before we get to questions to talk about the secondary storyline in the book. So I really wanted to make sure that the readers understood the personal toll that art looting had on families in France. Because if we just have Rose in the museum, and she's also outside the museum doing some cloak and dagger stuff, well, less dagger, but cloak, tracking down where the Nazis in her museum live and observing that they're taking paintings in the middle of the night and putting it into trucks from their apartment. But even so, I wanted everyone to understand that this widespread looting predominantly affected Jewish families in France. And so the story of Paul Rosenberg is very emblematic, since he's such a high profile modern art collector collecting the art that Hitler hates. And his family makes a decision in June 1940 to flee France, and they escape through Spain to Portugal and finally to the United States, because Alfred Barr, the director of MoMA, has written a letter of recommendation, and that has gotten the Rosenberg family around 17 visas to move their family to the United States. But his son, Alexander, is not permitted to leave France at the border because he is 19 years old, and there's a new decree in France that does not allow anyone over 19 to leave the country because they have to report for military service. And so these dual storylines, we have not only what happens with the Rosenberg art collection, which the Nazis tracked down to great effort over many years in the war. They find almost all of the hiding places that Paul has stashed his art in bank vaults and other places. But we also have, through his son, the military unfolding of World War II, and he becomes a lieutenant and is trained in England, is shipped off to Africa, returns to England to help with the invasion of Normandy, and then liberates Paris. And him and Rose have they cross paths in a really improbable, amazing way, which I don't want to give away, but you will discover that at the end of The Art Spy. And to this day, actually, the Rosenberg family continues to look for the art that has been looted from them that are still not found. Many paintings by Picasso and drawings, many works that are very personal to the family. And so their descendants, which include Anne Sinclair, the French journalist, and Maureen Rosenberg, who runs a gallery here in New York City, their work continues. And it's a very, very noble fight that they continue to wage. And so to tell the story of the Rosenberg family, a lot of the material came from MoMA's archives, the Morgan Library of Art, where a lot of letters from Paul Rosenberg are located. But I also got to go into their family home, which is now a business. Sorry, it hosts many offices and businesses. And one of the companies, after I emailed every company that's in this building, they let me come in and I got to line up the photographs of what it looked like before and what it looks like now. And then here are some photographs of what the building looked like when it was set up as an art gallery. And upstairs was the living quarters of the Rosenberg family. And this is an amazing cast iron winding staircase with paintings by Leger and Masson, etc. And they had a very beautiful, natural lit gallery with wood paneling in which people who were interested in purchasing art would come and sit and contemplate. But they also, Paul would hang exhibitions there by artists and sometimes combinations of artists to and welcome the public inside. And eventually it is taken over and commandeered by the Nazis and turned into a very terrible institution called the Institute for Study of Jewish Questions. And I know we should get to some questions, so I'll speed through. Yep, here we are. So Rachel, do you want to ask me some of the questions or should I go through them? What do you want me to do?
I can ask you some questions.
Okay, great.
First of all, thank you so much. This was amazing, and
Great.
it was a really lot of information. So let's see, how do we start? In 2014, the Neue Gallery in New York had an exhibition on degenerate art. That exhibition, there was a gallery that had empty picture frames hanging on the wall with notations about what paintings were formerly in the frames. So the notations were supposedly from Nazi lists. Do you know if any information that Rose collected corroborates the existence of those paintings as indicated in the Nazi list?
Oh, so I was not in that. I had not seen that exhibition in 2014, so I can't speak to that. However, as I mentioned, the Nazis took copious records, and a lot of those actually you can find in the U.S. National Archives, because when the Allies went in to Germany, in some of the castles, they found all of that documentation in filing cabinets and boxes. And so those cards that I mentioned that they would fill out are all scanned and in the U.S. National Archives. So you can actually look them up digitally, although the search is not great. But one of the most interesting ones, moving ones I found was the one labeled basically card number 1. And it was the Vermeer's Astronomer, and the Nazis were intent on finding that, and it was in the collection of the Rothschild family for many years. So the number 1 painting that they were looking for got inventory number 1.
Yeah, and I think I mean, you focused your research on France and on their national treasures, their art collections in public and private collections. So
Correct.
the list that was referred to at the Neue Gallery was the degenerate art that was taken out of German museums after.
Oh, I see. Yes.
In order to exhibit the art that was not approved by the Nazi regime. So
yeah. But it's true. Many of those are still missing. And even from the the auction in Lucerne, which I dedicate a chapter to, a lot of that art is still missing. Some of them went unsold and then disappeared. So, and things are surfacing all the time as well.
Look at this. Marianne is saying, I'm Paul Rosenberg's granddaughter.
Oh, yes.
Alexandra.
Hello, Marianne.
And Alexandra Rosenberg's daughter. The train, why not accurate? It is based on the true story on Alexandra stopping the last train of art leaving Paris. So this is exciting.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yes. That was the twist I didn't want to give away, but it's fine. Yes. So that's the wonderful connection. Really improbable. And everyone who has told me to read the book, loves reading about Alexander's story and how brave and heroic he was, and simply the tie is incredible. But a thing that you cannot even write, as fiction occurred in real life.
Yes, yes, exactly. Fabulous. I'm glad you're here, Marianne. And then somebody asked whether Rose continued after the war to assist in locating looted art so that it could be returned to their rightful owners. So,
Yes. So after the war, Rose is commissioned in both the French Army and US Army as a captain in the Beaux-Arts division. So essentially what they now call the Monuments Men. And she worked there for 8 years. She stayed one of the longest there restituting art. She was very single-minded in everything she did and was intent that she should stay there as long as possible to restitute this art back to the families they originally belonged to. And so when she returns to France, however, everything has changed. We are now in the Cold War. Nobody really wants to talk about World War II anymore and Nazis. And it's sort of thought that we got the big ones in Nuremberg. Why do we want to talk about people that were stealing art? I think now we think of it very differently, fortunately, looking back at history and understanding that these were, especially the tie with Jewish deportation and looting, all of this was terrible, right? It's not just stealing art; it's encompassed with the whole story of the Holocaust, and so she struggles when she comes back and is told that she has to actually take a pay cut back to her original pay salary from from the war and her same position. But she does go to work in restitution for the Rothschild family. That was one new discovery that I also made, which was very exciting to find. And once again, is sort of hustling her way, and then writes her book, and then the movie is optioned, and so it has a brush of fame, but then dies almost virtually unknown, and almost nobody goes to her funeral, which is very sad.
wow. That kind of answers the question whether the French government recognizes Rose's efforts after the war. Were they?
Yeah, so she was very medaled after the war. It's said that she's perhaps one of the most medaled women in World War II, certainly in France. So she receives the Légion d'honneur, the Médaille de Résistance, the Resistance Medal, many other medals. But for many reasons, her story becomes suppressed over time. She's actually warned by the former French ambassador to Germany not to write the memoir of her book. She says later that she was afraid almost for her life, and warns another monuments officer not to write his memoir. And her book is pulled off of the shelves, and she spends a lot of effort writing to all the libraries in France, hoping to give it to them for free. She says, I'll mail you my book. She was worried that this information and knowledge would disappear. And so I think she would have been very distressed by what happened with her legacy, because based on what I saw going through hundreds of thousands of her documents, she was very intent on making sure what happened in World War II remained known. But fortunately, starting in the late 1990s, her hometown created an association in her name. It's called I guess I mentioned it earlier, but for the Association for the Memory of Rose Valland. And it's run now by a real firecracker of a woman from Saint-Étienne-de-Saint-Gilloise who has really pushed to keep Rose Valland's memory alive through exhibitions and other things. So 2 years ago, they renamed the plaza next to the Jeu de Paume after Rose Valland. They did a ceremony, and there's like a marker there now. So there had been a plaque on the side of the museum, which nobody really noticed unless you were searching for it. But now there is more. And so, of course, through not only my effort, but everyone else's efforts that have worked on the story of Rose and the story of looting, she becomes more in the more known. And now there's actually a movement to relocate her body to the Pantheon. But I need to talk to people about that, because Joyce needs to come too, if so, because they're purposefully buried together.
Yeah. So somebody's asking whether Rose's relationship with Joyce lasted a long time.
It did. So basically 50 years. And So we don't know exactly when they started dating, but they met in the late 1920s and are moved in together by 1936. And Joyce dies in around, I think, 77 of breast cancer, which devastates Rose. Some people say she lost her mind afterwards. She managed to get Joyce's PhD thesis published, which Joyce finishes on her deathbed, and then at some point is moved into a care home. So that's Rose, and she dies in obscurity in 1980. But one of the letters I found late in the game, which was very moving, was a letter that Rose wrote about Joyce to her cousin after Joyce dies, where she mentions, "We lived 50 years together."
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So Michael wanted to know where Rose learned German. Was that due to her relationship with Joyce, or?
Yes, we believe it's through Joyce. I hesitate, and I don't say in the book that she was fluent in German. I say that she understood German and could read some German. And I say this because her early notes from the wartime, you can tell she's listening phonetically to the names, and she doesn't really know how to spell them in German correctly. And she puts question marks throughout her notes as she's trying to understand it. And of course, it must have improved throughout the war as she's listening to these conversations. And Joyce would have helped her at home to decipher documents and teach her some German as well. But she could not let on, of course, in the museum that she had any understanding of this language.
Okay, wow. So did you come across correspondence between Valland and women in the MFAA, like Edith Standen or
Yes.
Hacker?
Yes, she was quite close to Edith Standen, and there's many photographs of them together in Germany. And so there are letters between the two that are scattered throughout various archives. You could tell they very respected each other. And one of the big discoveries in my book was proving that an event that Rose saw in the Jeu de Paume of the Nazis burning 500 modern paintings. Rose was questioned on it immediately after she put it in her memoir, and that kind of doubt has lasted to the present day. So I knew in this book, if I wanted to include it, since this book is told from the perspective of the characters, I would need either a smoking gun or not included, or have a voice come in and say, historian X says this. And so I did end up finding 4 notarized testimonies from the guards that were there, including one that was asked to light the fire of the bonfire, and many, many details about what happened and the paintings that were there. But one of the things when she was trying to get all this evidence, when she was being questioned, was to reach out to Edith Standen and ask if Edith had any documents in the U.S. archive, in the U.S. side, that could prove some of these accusations wrong. And I traced back why that doubt exists. When you have myths, whether it's about New York City, which I've long written about, you have to trace back where it comes from. And I discovered that it was the very Germans in the museum who had knifed and stomped on the paintings and burned them, who came out to say it never happened. And they added, if it did, it was Rose. So your classic deny and then deflect strategy in play. And for me, that was the most gratifying part of this whole book, was to try to set the record straight on something that really bothered her for the rest of her life, that people didn't believe her about this. But we trust her about everything else, apparently, and this one thing was questioned.
Yeah, unbelievable. Wow. So Nina is asking, were the Germans interested in obtaining the paintings that the French stored for safety prior to the war? The ones where you showed the pictures that were packed up to protect against bombs.
Yes. So one thing to note is that the Germans always vary by the book. So initially, they were only able to take the art that belonged to Jewish collections because they were labeled as abandoned. The families had fled. And of course, then later they were denationalized. So therefore, the Germans could take it. So that was an illegal statute. But they were very interested in things in the art collections. And you see some decrees where there's an attempt to say, we can now also take everything in the museums. And so the German art historians would come regularly to Chambord and other castles and ask to inspect art that was in the French collections. And you also see people like Ribbentrop trying to exchange paintings straight off the walls from the Louvre. He wanted a painting called Diana coming out of the bath, and he spent many years trying to get it. And at some point, the French agreed to send it over to Germany, but the French were very good at bureaucracy. And so every time they would like delay, say there all this paperwork. And in this case, they knew if they demanded something that Germany would never give up, that painting would have to come back. And so it was a gamble, but because the Germans were so by the book, they promptly sent it back to the Louvre. So yes, and over the course of the war, the expansion of what could be looted kept widening, and eventually it was basically like, oh, anything Germanic is up for grabs. But in terms of the stuff in the collection, there still had to be some kind of formal purchase or exchange. They didn't straight up loot it in the same way that they did with Jewish family collections.
Right, right. Yeah. And they were very very focused and very clearly targeted, knew what was where. So that's another thing that's quite.
Yes, they knew in advance. They had been making reports about where everything was.
They were well prepared. So a lot of people thank you. Michelle.
Thank you so much.
I just want to join them.